Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, bold, and controversial, a leader some fear, many admire, but none can ignore. When a journalist publicly mocked him during a live press conference, everyone expected fire. But what Traoré said next silenced the room and shook the nation. This isn't just a political story. It's about truth, legacy, and a moment that redefined leadership. Watch till the end. You won't forget what happens next. The press hall was buzzing with quiet tension. Microphones clicked on, camera lights flickered, and every journalist in the room had their notepads ready. At the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stoic, composed, and dressed not in a designer suit, but in his simple military uniform. His presence didn't ask for respect, it commanded it. The nation had been through hell over the past decade, military coups, foreign interference, and civil unrest. And yet, in the middle of all this, a 34-year-old captain had risen to power, claiming to restore dignity and peace to the people. To some, he was a revolutionary, to others, reckless. In the third row sat Samuel Rhodes, a young journalist with a reputation for asking the questions others were too afraid to say out loud. His father, once a celebrated war reporter, had died in mysterious circumstances during a military operation years ago. Samuel grew up watching leaders speak with honeyed words while doing little to change the reality on the ground. Today, he wasn't here to be polite. He was here to expose what he believed was another pretender in uniform. The moderator gave a short introduction. Captain Traoré will take a few questions. Please keep them respectful and direct. The first few questions were cautious. Captain, how do you plan to stabilize the economy while continuing military reforms? Are there talks with neighboring countries about border security? Traoré answered each one calmly. His voice was low, measured, but firm. He didn't dodge questions. He didn't play politics. Then Samuel stood up. He didn't wait to be called. He didn't wait for permission. Captain Traoré, Samuel began, his voice louder than necessary. A lot of people in this country see you as a symbol of hope, but hope without experience is just a dream, and dreams don't lead nations. The room froze, eyes turned, cameras immediately pointed in his direction. Samuel continued, "You're 34. You took power with guns, not votes. You speak about peace, but you wear a uniform built for war. How are you any different from the men you replaced?" Traoré didn't blink. Samuel's voice hardened. "You're young, you're untested, and in a nation already burning, you think fire will put out fire. Or maybe, just maybe, you're addicted to power like the rest of them." A quiet gasp echoed in the back of the room. A journalist dropped her pen. Another mouthed, "He's done." But Samuel wasn't done. He took one step forward, locking eyes with the captain. "You call yourself a leader, but all I see is a soldier playing a politician. So tell us, Captain, what gives you the right to lead a nation like ours?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom in on Traoré or the young man who just threw a grenade of words into the room. Every pair of eyes, including those watching live across the country, waited for an explosion, a snap, a shutdown. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move. He looked at Samuel calmly, almost like he was looking through him. And then, slowly, a small, unexpected smile formed on his face. "Let me tell you a story," Traoré said, his voice quiet, but filled with something deeper than anger, something heavier. The room didn't know what was coming, but they leaned in. Even Samuel, despite himself, stood still. Because in that moment, something shifted. And what Traoré was about to say would not only answer the question, it would change the course of the entire nation. The silence in the room was heavy. Cameras refocused. Journalists straightened in their seats. Nobody interrupted, not even Samuel. Something in Traoré's voice, the way he said, "Let me tell you a story," had stripped the arrogance from the air. "I was 12, Traoré began, eyes still on Samuel. "We lived in a small village that doesn't exist anymore. It was burned to the ground by rebels when I was 14. But before that, I remember something my mother used to say every night before we slept. You don't lead with noise. You lead with pain and what you do with it." He looked away briefly, as if seeing the past play behind his eyes. My father was a teacher. He refused to leave the village when the fighting got closer. He said knowledge would be our only weapon. One day they came. He stood in front of them, holding a book, not a gun. They shot him in front of the school, while I watched, hidden in a tree. Gasps echoed in the room. A few journalists lowered their heads. I ran that day, not to escape, but to survive. Because even at 14, I knew someone would have to remember. Someone would have to come back. And I did. His voice never rose, but the weight of his words made the walls feel like they were closing in. I didn't pick up a gun because I loved it. I picked it up because peace doesn't listen unless someone shouts through chaos. I joined a rebel force that was trying to protect the civilians. I watched friends die with nothing in their pockets, but folded up pictures of their families. I stopped counting the graves when I turned 21. He turned back to Samuel. You say I wear a uniform built for war. Maybe you're right, but it's the same uniform I was wearing when we pulled out 12 children from a collapsed school. The same uniform I was wearing when I walked unarmed into a rebel camp to negotiate the release of 53 kidnapped villagers. The same one I had on when I carried the body of a dead soldier, who called me his brother, not his captain. Traoré paused. The entire room was dead quiet. Even the sound of someone breathing felt too loud. Leadership isn't about age. It's not about suits, titles, or even elections. It's about sacrifice, real sacrifice, giving up your name, your safety, your dreams, for people who may never know what you gave up for them. He stepped forward, eyes still locked on Samuel. You think I crave control? But real power doesn't lie awake at night, haunted by children with missing limbs. It doesn't pen letters to grieving mothers. It doesn't visit graves at sunrise, the only hour a leader can weep unseen. Samuel's lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. And you say I'm untested? Traoré continued, softer now. My test wasn't on a stage. It was in fire, blood, and silence. I passed when I didn't lose myself to it. A subtle movement stirred in the room. One of the older journalists wiped her eyes. Another put his notepad down, as if writing anything would cheapen what had just been said. Traoré finally took a breath and looked away from Samuel, letting the room absorb it all. For those who think leadership is just about being loud, he said, let me tell you something. Some of the strongest voices I ever heard came from people who never raised theirs. The silence now was no longer tense. It was reverent. But just when the room thought the moment had peaked, just when emotion began to settle into respect. Traoré's eyes flicked back to Samuel, and with a calmness that chilled the air, he said, You think you know me, Samuel. But what if I told you? Your father did. Heads turned sharply. Samuel's body stiffened. What if I told you your father trained under me, and once told me something I'll never forget? The room was already breathless, but now it was holding something heavier, something about to break. Samuel's face went pale, drained of color like the blood had left him. His mouth twitched, trying to form words, but his brain hadn't caught up with what he'd just heard. The camera zoomed in. Not for drama. This was history unfolding. Traoré stayed still for a moment. His eyes were no longer sharp. They held something more complicated now. Sadness, memory, a hint of guilt. Your father, Traoré began, was one of the bravest men I've ever known. And I don't say that lightly. Samuel blinked rapidly. You know my father? Traoré nodded. Captain Elias Okoro. He served under my command for 11 months. In most jobs, 11 months is nothing. But in the bush, it's a lifetime. But in the bush, where every hour could be your last, 11 months can feel like a lifetime. And he carried himself like a man who knew his clock was ticking. I never knew he was in the army, Samuel muttered, almost to himself. Traoré stepped closer. He never talked about it because he wanted you to grow up free of that weight. He said, My boy deserves the truth, but not the kind soaked in blood. He wanted you to become a writer, not a fighter. That's what he told me. Samuel's head dropped, shoulders heavy, fingers trembling as he held his pen. Traoré continued. We were ambushed once. I still remember that day. Your father took a bullet in the leg, but kept fighting until we got everyone out. After the attack, he sat beside me under a broken tree. We were both covered in mud and ash, and he looked at me, breathing hard, and said..." Traoré paused. Emotion crept into his voice now. He said, "If I don't make it out of this war, and if someday people question you the way they'll always question men who lead, just tell them this. I followed him not because he shouted orders, but because he carried us when we couldn't walk." The room shattered. Quiet sobs echoed from the back rows. One of the cameramen wiped his eyes but didn't stop filming. "You were 12 when he died, weren't you?" Traoré asked. Samuel looked up, eyes glossy. "Yeah, car accident. That's what they told me." Traoré gave a soft nod. "He was being transported to a hospital. He never made it." "And you were there?" Samuel asked, voice thin like paper. "I was holding his hand," Traoré replied, eyes locked on him. His last words were, "Don't let my son grow up bitter. Remind him someday that silence isn't weakness, and truth always comes late, but when it does, it thunders." Samuel stood frozen, as if his whole identity was unraveling in front of strangers and spotlights. The arrogance that once coated his tone was gone, melted into confusion, grief, and something deeper. Shame. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he whispered. Traoré looked around the room, then back at him. "Because I didn't want you to believe my story just because of your father. I wanted you to question me. I wanted you to demand better, because that's what good journalists do. That's what Elias would have wanted." Samuel stepped back, visibly shaking. The camera caught it all, the flickering emotions across his face. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, guilt. "I mocked you," he said, barely audible, in front of everyone, without knowing anything. Traoré didn't flinch. "And I answered you, not with anger, but with the truth, because men like your father didn't die in silence. They died so people like you could ask hard questions, without fear." Samuel's breath hitched. He dropped his notepad. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I judged you without knowing you. I thought I was exposing a fraud, but all I did was expose myself." Traoré walked toward him, slow but steady. The entire room leaned forward. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loud. Then Traoré did something no one expected. He extended his hand. Samuel looked at it, stunned, then slowly reached out and shook it. At that moment, hand in hand, eyes locked, it was no longer just a press conference. It was a turning point, a young man confronting the truth about his past, a leader proving strength through grace, a nation watching two sides collide and unite. The handshake didn't just end the tension, it broke. The silence inside the room turned sacred. That handshake between Samuel and Captain Traoré wasn't just a gesture, it was a symbol. One hand represented doubt, the other dignity. Together, they held something far heavier than flesh. The moment stretched. Cameras clicked softly, not intruding, but recording history. The journalists, who had once prepared sharp questions, now looked away, their eyes wet, ashamed of what they had expected and who they had underestimated. Samuel slowly released the handshake. He didn't step back. His voice, fragile but real, filled the room. "I spent my entire career chasing scandals, thinking the truth always had to be ugly to be real. I mocked you because I believed that a man my age couldn't possibly carry a country on his back. But today, you carried me." Someone gasped quietly. "I called you power-hungry," Samuel continued, "but I didn't realize how much power it takes just to stay human in a world that keeps tearing men down for being too soft or too strong." He turned to the cameras now, this time not as a hunter, but as a witness. "I apologize to the nation, and to this man. Captain Traoré didn't need to prove anything, but he did, with patience, with honesty, and with more grace than I ever had the decency to give him." He paused, breathing deeply. "I'm not here to salvage my image. I lost that the moment I stood up with arrogance. But maybe I can rebuild something better now, with the truth." Traoré finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost warm. Your father once told me that leadership isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the last to fall apart when everyone else does. Today, you stood back up. That's harder than standing tall in the first place. The room reacted, not with applause. No one dared ruin the weight of the air, but with stillness, with respect. Suddenly, Traoré stepped toward the podium again. Cameras refocused. Reporters wiped their eyes, straightened their jackets. The captain adjusted the mic. "This country is not built by perfect men," he said. "It's built by broken ones who keep showing up anyway, who bleed and cry and still choose peace. You don't have to agree with me, but you will never say again that I lead for power. I lead because I've buried too many good men who didn't get the chance to." He looked directly at the front row, where the older journalists sat stunned and silent. "You wanted headlines. Here's one for you," he said calmly. "Truth wins, even if it takes a little longer." Samuel nodded slowly, still processing. A younger reporter in the back finally stood up. She looked barely out of college. "Captain," she asked softly, "what do you want the children of this nation to learn from today?" Traoré looked directly at her. That no matter how loud the world gets, the quiet truth will always find its way. And that forgiveness is not weakness. It's the most powerful kind of courage. The lights dimmed slightly. Maybe it was the setting sun outside, or maybe it was just the end of something toxic lifting from the room. As Traoré stepped down from the podium, Samuel moved aside, not as an opponent anymore, but almost like a student giving way to a teacher. Whispers began around the room, not gossipy, but reverent, emotional. "Did you see his face when he mentioned the father? I've never seen Samuel like that, never. He didn't destroy him, he redeemed him." Outside the press building, a crowd had gathered. Live feeds from news stations across the country were already looping clips of the confrontation, the story behind Samuel's father, and the unexpected apology that followed. What began as a hit piece had turned into a moment of national reflection. People watching from their homes, cafes, even subway stations, all sat in silence, staring at their screens. And many weren't watching Traoré. They were watching Samuel and seeing a bit of themselves, pride, mistakes, regret, and maybe the chance for grace. Across the nation, screens lit up with replay after replay. News anchors abandoned their usual tone of detachment. "Something incredible happened today," one of them said, eyes moist. "This wasn't just a press conference. It was a mirror held up to our society." Social media exploded. Hashtags like #TruthWins and #Samuel apologizes began trending within minutes. The most shared clip wasn't the moment Samuel mocked Traoré. It was when he broke down, humbled, apologizing through trembling lips. That raw humanity struck a nerve. An elderly woman in Alabama tweeted, "I've watched politics my whole life, but I've never cried watching a press event until today." Captain Traoré showed us what real leadership looks like. A high school debate club in Ohio paused their lesson to watch the full speech. Their teacher, a veteran, stood quietly in the corner, fighting tears. One student whispered, "I didn't know leaders could be that human." In Brooklyn, a single mother named Elena gathered her 2 sons. She replayed the part where Traoré said, "This country is not built by perfect men." Her sons watched silently. One of them, just 12, said, "I want to be like him." Even Traoré's harshest critics in political circles struggled to find an angle. What could they say against a man who, when publicly insulted, responded with history, heart, and humility? Back at the press building, Samuel sat alone in a side room, eyes still red. His phone buzzed endlessly. Calls, messages, emails. He ignored them all until one message caught his eye. It was from his mother. "Your father would be proud. You finally saw what I always saw in him, and maybe now, in yourself too." Samuel broke down again, not in front of cameras, not for headlines, but quietly, like a son who finally understood his father's silence, his strength, and his strange calm in chaos. That night, he opened his laptop. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to chase a scandal. He didn't sharpen his words like weapons. Instead, he wrote, slowly, thoughtfully. The headline, "The Leader I Misjudged, a Lesson in Honor." The article wasn't just a recount of the press conference. It was a confession, a reflection. He wrote about his own arrogance, his blind spots, and how a soldier-turned-leader turned a confrontation into a masterclass in dignity. Within hours of publication, the article spread like wildfire, not because it was explosive, but because it was honest. People shared it not just for the story, but because they felt seen in it. They saw their own assumptions, their own quick judgments, their own need for grace. By morning, Samuel had offers from major platforms to appear on talk shows. He declined them all. Instead, he issued a simple statement. Some stories aren't meant to boost careers, they're meant to heal nations. Captain Traoré, on the other hand, refused to gloat. When asked for a comment, he only said, "The young man apologized." "That's enough for me. Let's focus now on what our country truly needs, unity, not spectacle." And that, perhaps, was the final twist. He didn't capitalize on the moment. He didn't turn Samuel's humiliation into political gain. He let the truth breathe. In a time when the world expected rage, Traoré gave grace. When they wanted a clash, he gave a conversation. When they feared weakness, he showed them real strength. The phrase press room redemption would go down in history. But it wasn't about Samuel, or even Traoré. It was about all of us, about how quickly we judge, and how rarely we listen, and how powerful it is when we finally do.